Well, hello everyone, and welcome back to another installment in our reviewed and ranked series. We are now into the very exciting portion of the roster where we're talking about the DLC characters, and today's character is very unique in a lot of different ways. This is actually one of the most interesting characters in terms of how they are built to function in the entirety of the DLC characters added to the game, and that is, of course, the vengeful dhampir, yes, I said that correctly, Blade. Blade is a really awesome character for a lot of different reasons. I'm excited to see the MCU do more with this character going forward. The old Blade films are phenomenal as well. There's just a lot to love about this character, and there are many reasons why he's held in such high esteem. So if you're excited for us to talk a little bit more about Blade and how he functions in this game, make sure that you drop that like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for that daily variety content, and let's go ahead and jump in to the character breakdown. Blade has 9 different synergies that can be achieved throughout a team build. And I think that there's a lot of good things in here as well. So let's go ahead and go through them. He has 3 strength synergies with anti-heroes, martial artists, and cutting edge. He has 3 mastery synergies with Midnight Suns, Sharpshooters, and Marvel Knights. He has a vitality synergy with Gods and Demons. He has an energy synergy with Avengers, and he has a resilience synergy with Back in Black. Now, I've said in many of the previous installments of this series that I put a very high value on the strength and mastery and energy synergies, and although there's only 1 energy synergy mingled in this very extensive list, the other synergies that he does have allows you to pad out the remainder of the team very nicely. That serves both in terms of bolstering strength and bolstering the efficiency of team synergy attacks within combat. So a very excellent choice for padding out the bulk of your team. Now, if I had to put Blade in a category, I don't really like to do this with these characters, but Blade very much fits the role of crowd control the character, and you'll see how that rings true as we analyze and break down his kit a little bit further. So let's go ahead and start with his standard functions, and of course that starts with his basic attack sequence. His basic attack sequence has simultaneous hits from both of his swords as he swings them out in front of him, and that will connect a total of 4 different times into the opponents. They do make physical contact as you are hacking and slashing through the opponents, and that works really well against the grunt type characters because, again, it discourages retaliation as you are layering in your attacks to your opponents. Blade's heavy attack is also fairly interesting because it is a series of spins that he throws out while kind of turning onto his side. And there are 3 connecting hits of that spin as he progresses forward, and again that does have physical contact and a fair amount of knockdown as he twirls and tumbles into the fray of the opponents he's facing off against. Blade does have a mid-air double jump, and this feature is not uncommon among the cast by any means, and it certainly helps him with some of the hazardous traversals that you can expect to see throughout the various different aspects of the story quest and other challenges in this type of a setting. Blade's falling aerial is one of the low points of this character, and it's just because it has such a finite focal point and can only be fired once while Blade is up in the air, and that is really unfortunate. He shoots out a silver stake that will impale into the ground, and it will deal a decent amount of damage if you do manage to connect it. However, it's such a finite area and requires a lot of knowledge as to where it's going to land in order to get any sort of benefit out of it. And to put the final nail on the coffin for this aspect of this character, he doesn't have any abilities that put him in a situation where he would use this attack organically. So again, not a whole lot of benefit to using the falling aerial, and it's faithful to the character's origins and design, but I would highly suggest that you just shy away from it completely because it's not nearly worth the reward that you can get out of it on the off chance that you do land this attack. And of course we have the block and dodge animation. This involves Blade crossing his swords out in front of him, and as he dodges out of the way of incoming blows, he will perform a forward somersault in that direction. Again, that's fairly consistent with the nimble nature of this character, since he has to take on superhuman vampire types all the time. So if he's sluggish, it very much means a bad day for him. So the more nimble he can be, the better. Let's pivot over and talk a little bit about the abilities. And just like last week, we will be outlining an ability that has DLC privilege. Now, all of his moves have a certain amount of an extra allowance than other members of the cast. As a matter of fact, Blade's abilities work drastically different from everyone else in this cast, including the other DLC characters, because these abilities can be charged up significantly beyond their base function, and you can kind of tell that based off of the aura that radiates off of Blade, with the maximum potency being reached by the time you have that red aura emanating from around the character. Additionally, while these abilities are being charged, he has a certain degree of super armor, meaning that he's less likely to get knocked out of the animation of charging the ability, as well as maintaining some degree of mobility, though he does move at a very reduced rate compared to his standard movement speed. But being able to redirect the ability before you unleash it, for those that are directionally inclined, is a really big benefit, as well as being able to reposition if that is what you are needing to do. So now that you know how all of his abilities work on a base common ground, we can talk about how they work individually. And the first one is the spinning swords. Now, this attack is a very interesting ability, and of the abilities that Blade has, it's probably the most consistent damage dealer out of all of them, but I think that there are other moves in his kit that are more deserving of the DLC privilege move, or receiving that specific award in this case. But don't let that deter you, because Blade, like I said, he can charge up this attack, and upon unleashing it, he will jump up into the air and unleash a spinning cut. This tends to work best among the grunt-type characters on the roster, as it will raise them up into the air along with them, leaving them defenseless and subject to the entirety of the damage that this attack can unleash. Now, one thing that it is important to note is you can synergize this attack with other members of your team, but to get its maximum potency, you need to use it as a standalone ability, because it will not detonate at its maximum potency when used within a team synergy attack. So you've got to weigh your pros and cons there, and as a matter of fact, Blade would easily be one of the most broken DLC characters if he did get the maximum charge benefit out of using his synergies with the other members of the team. But spinning swords does very well for cutting down opponents, especially those grunt types, and can serve a decent amount against the mighty enemies, but it's a lot more circumstantial, and he doesn't tend to pull them up as easily as he does the grunt characters into the bulk of the strikes that happen as he spins around in the air. This attack has the piercing attack type and the launch synergy trait, boasts some pretty respectable figures in terms of damage, having a B classification and a C rating to the stagger damage dealt, while maintaining that same C rating to the energy points consumed. And while I'm on this point, it is important to note that as you continue to maintain the charge of the ability, it will not drain out of the energy points that Blade has available until the attack is actually unleashed. So you can hold that charged seemingly forever with any of these abilities, as well as maneuver around without compromising the energy points available. And on a common ground between all of Blade's abilities, there is the benefit of a reduced energy point cost, an increased power for the full charge of the abilities, an increase in the damage done to the stagger gauge, and finally the reduced chance of the attack being interrupted. Blade's second ability is the high stakes ability, and this involves some rapid velocity silver spikes being shot out, this time horizontally instead of at a downward trajectory and into a very specific focal point. At its maximum charge, which does take a couple of seconds to get up to, he will fire 7 stakes, one after the other, and you can redirect those stakes as he is firing them, as I demonstrate in the footage here. And they're not the best in terms of damage, but they do allow for a lot of high impact strikes one after the other. So despite the fact that they don't deal a lot of damage individually, if you layer 7 of those spikes into one specific target, you can rip through them fairly quickly. Again, this move is not really worthy of that DLC privilege seal of approval. This ability has the projectile attack type and the bash synergy trait, and has relatively lackluster stats with an E classification to damage, a C classification to energy points consumed, and a D classification to the stagger damage dealt. The third ability that Blade possesses is the Bleeding Edge, and do not let the stats on this move fool you, because this ability has a lot to offer and it packs a considerable punch. This ability is the only one in Blade's kit that cannot be synergized, and that is for very, very good reason. Because this glaive that Blade will throw out will bounce around the battlefield off of your opponents, not off of the walls and other structures, but off of the opponents and rebound from opponent to opponent as it flies around the battlefield. And when you have this thing at maximum charge, you can mow through your opponents, whether they are mighty enemies with stagger gauges or just grunt type enemies that are scattered throughout the battlefield. And this is a little bit of a controversial take, probably in my opinion, but I do believe that this particular ability is worthy of the DLC privilege award. And you'll see here with the footage that I'm showing of one of the endgame fights on ultimate difficulty that this Bleeding Edge makes very, very short work of the Outrider opponents. Sure, it bounces off and it can be a little bit unreliable. It's best used in large groups of opponents, and this fight very much fills that requirement. And if you get a lot of connecting hits with this ability, again, it just mows through your opponents and leaves them very vulnerable to follow up from yourself or other teammates with which you are fighting. So this one, it looks lackluster with its stats, but it is highly deceptive in what it is fully capable of, especially when it attacks multiple different opponents and even hits some of those opponents multiple times during the duration of the glaive's trajectory. This ability has the piercing attack type, and the stats, again, have a deceiving rating of D to the damage dealt and D to the stagger damage dealt, while maintaining that C classification to the energy points consumed. Blade's fourth ability is the Off the Chain ability, where Blade will swing around a tethered blade to attack everything in the area in his immediate vicinity. And at its full charge, you will get more swings around his head, which again is going to be a little bit better for rendering those opponents a bit more vulnerable to follow-up. And this was a very, very close call for receiving that DLC privilege move, but again, there's a couple of inconsistencies with this move and how it maintains Blade locked into one position, whereas with the Bleeding Edge, he is mobile to attack in and kind of combo off of his own ability as the Bleeding Edge does its own thing. But this is still a really good ability to use because of the sheer range that it has. This has a little bit more range even than attacks that we've seen out of characters like Luke Cage, who also has abilities where he will swing a chain around. And it deals a considerable amount of damage to the opponents that are stuck within that radius. Again, as you are charging up this ability, you can move and position yourself ideally in the midst of a group of opponents, and that super armor will help you get into a point where you can detonate this ability for maximum amount of damage, and it will keep those opponents locked into that radius and allow the rest of the team to chain combo into this ability and make short work of your opponents. This ability has the piercing attack type and the area assault synergy trait, has the D classification to damage, a C classification to energy points consumed, and staggered damage dealt. Blade's extreme ability again falls into the category of crowd control. It's not the greatest in terms of attacking into boss characters, though it does have a very wide cone of effect out in front of the character. Now, Blade does not reposition when he uses this ability, so you do need to be mindful of where he's facing when you detonate his extreme attack, but he will initiate this attack by throwing out a couple of gaseous containers that will stun and stagger the opponents in the field of effect before he follows up with a couple of rapid fire blasts with some handguns, and then finally finishes things off with a double sword slash as he lunges forward into that mist that he has unleashed upon his opponents. And it's a pretty quick attack at that, taking about 4 seconds exactly to fully run its course. So a lot of really good things to see with Blade's extreme ability, especially if you use it in the confines of attacking into large groups of grunts and other characters. So now that we have looked at Blade and his functions and how his abilities work, it's time for us to determine where he belongs on the character tier list. And he is very powerful against grunt-type opponents, but he does have a fair amount of less than desirable matchups against a wide variety in this cast. And particularly he will struggle against boss-type characters if you're trying to use his charged abilities against them, because a lot of those bosses have attacks that are strong enough to overwhelm the super armor that Blade has, and when you're relegated to using those abilities in the context of Team Synergies, it's still nice for the extra damage, but you lose a lot of the potential with that, especially the Spinning Swords ability, which is one of the better abilities for Blade in terms of combat with those opponents, because it's incapable of scooping up the mighty enemies and the boss characters as well. So where does he fit in? He's certainly more useful than the lower tiers and the characters that are listed within here. And I think he falls just outside of A tier because he focuses a lot more specifically on being a crowd control character. And you do need those in the cast. They are very needed and very integral to a team build, but Blade just doesn't quite have what it takes to layer in that damage to the higher tiered opponents in this game. But despite the fact that he falls just outside of A tier, I do feel that he hits hard enough to dethrone Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, as the top of the B tier classification. So we'll go ahead and move some of these characters out of the way so we can allow Blade to sit in that higher location. And I'm going to have to organize these off screen because there's a lot of characters that I need to move around with this reorganization of the B tier. But what do you think? Do you agree with my placement for Blade? Do you feel like there's anything that I have missed with him? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are, and don't forget to subscribe for that daily variety content because we are just on the cusp of 1,000 subscribers, and it's been a quite enjoyable journey over the past 2 years to get to this point. Thanks again for your time, and we'll see you in the next video, everyone. Take care.